So by now, we know if you are given a set of short-run average cost curves, how to derive the long-run average cost. But what should this long-run average cost curve look like? By now, you should realize that there's this relationship between costs and production. So if you think back as to how productivity depended on size, you should be probably to come up with the right answer. The shape of the long-run average cost curve should depend upon economies of scale and economies of scope. So what does that mean? Well, we said if there are economies or diseconomies of scale, then that reduces or increases costs in the long run. So, in other words, if there are economies of scale, increased size will lead to higher productivity. And higher productivity obviously leads to lower costs. Also, conversely, if there are diseconomies of scale, then increased size of production will lead to lower productivity. And lower productivity must increase costs. So therefore, you would say that as long as there are economies of scale, the long-run average cost would be decreasing, and when there are diseconomies of scale, then the long-run average cost would increase. Typically, we like to think that initially as an establishment starts out small, it experiences economies of scale. And then after a point, all these economies of scale go away, and you probably have pretty much constant returns to scale. And then finally, as the size of the establishment gets too big, then you have diseconomies of scale. So consequently, you would expect your long-run average cost curve to also be U-shaped, but to be much more shallow in nature. So initially, costs or average cost would come down because of economies of scale, remain fairly constant for a while, and then eventually start increasing again as the size becomes too large. So actually, this idea of economies of scale gives you an interesting insight into the size of firms. Why is it that some firms are very big, and why is it some firms are typically much smaller? So for instance, if you look around, you will find that things like steel, electricity, and aluminum, etc. are produced in very large firms. Then things like cars, refrigerators, etc. are produced in a large scale, but probably not at the scale of steel and aluminum. And then finally, things like, say, hospitals or medical services or legal services, chartered accountants tend to be typically quite small. Why does that happen? And one answer to that question is maybe because of economies of scale. It's quite possible that for large-scale manufacturing, there are very strong economies of scale, whereas for services, typically maybe the economies of scale peter out very quickly, and maybe diseconomies of scale enter the arena much earlier than in manufacturing. So economies of scale sort of, or diseconomies of scale, sort of put a normal boundary, natural boundary to the how big a firm can be. So we have finished talking about costs and production. We shall use the knowledge that we have gathered here to talk about competition, hopefully next week.